Look, y'all already know me. I can't go anywhere without picking up a new piece of art, a little trinket, a poster, something for the crib. That's why the Other Art Fair, that's a dangerous place for me. It's 4 days of independent artists, thousands of original artwork starting at around $100. Even if you're not trying to buy something, you can meet the artists, attend workshops and interactive installations, or, hang around for the mini golf, the DJ sets, and the fully stocked bar. Add the Other Art Fair to your calendar. It's October 30th through November 2nd at Artifact Events in Ravenswood, and tickets start at just $20. Book your tickets online at theotherartfair.com. Fasten your seatbelts for an all areas access conversation spanning a decade inside Formula One with none other than former Haas F1 team principal Gunther Steiner. Unfiltered Live is an event no Formula One fan, hell, no racing fan should miss. The star of Netflix's smash hit docuseries Drive to Survive will take you on a wild ride through his career in motorsports and his decade of working on the Haas team. And it's for one night only. November 15th, Unfiltered Live at the Cadillac Palace Theater. Tickets at BroadwayInChicago.com. Today on CityCast Chicago, Mayor Brandon Johnson has finally released his budget proposal for next year, so let's see what's in it. It's Monday, October 20th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. So all summer long, we have been talking about this $1.19 billion budget gap, and now we have an actual proposal in front of us. So we're going to get into the nitty gritty of those budget details, but would you characterize this budget as noteworthy or different or more of the same, given we have had some structural deficits year over year? They're forecasted for years moving forward, but given the stress of the federal funding cuts, is this different or is this similar to what we've seen?
It's different. It is a completely new approach than we saw during Johnson's first 2 years in office. And, I think that he is going to say, look, I'm no longer a rookie mayor, right? We're in the back half of what he hopes to be his first term in office. He says, I know how city government works now, and I was elected, he says, to do things differently. So we're going to do things differently. I think that, the question is going to be, is this an approach that is going to be endorsed by a majority of the Chicago City Council? And I think that this year, really for the first time, nobody expects the City Council to just sort of, rubber stamp this budget or tinker at the margins. Everybody's fully prepared for the City Council to act like an independent body, a government, and sort of dig into the details, perhaps make their own proposals. And that is a lightning change from, how it was when I started back in 2016, 2017. That gives Johnson, both more work to do, right? Because he's got to figure out a plan how to sort of keep everybody happy. But it also sort of frees him up a little bit, because if you're not going to get to 50, if you're not going to get a rubber stamp, well, then why not try some stuff? And he's certainly trying some stuff.
Let's start with some of the new taxes. The biggest one would be trying to generate $333 million from a cloud computing tax. What exactly does that mean and look like?
So the best way to explain it is to think about you going to rent a car. You are leasing that car. The city taxes that transaction. You pay a little bit of money to the city, the state, and this sort of increases that. Now, several years ago, back when sort of Google and Amazon and all of the big tech firms were getting going, the city said, hey, you know what? You are leasing server space. You are leasing sort of digital sort of assets. And we in the city charge a tax when you lease stuff. So we are going to tax you leasing sort of digital asset here. And it went through a whole court process. The courts upheld it. And so now that tax is sort of firmly in place. And for the second year in a row, it's going to go up pretty significantly if this is a proposal that's adopted. So this proposal would generate, as you said, $333 million more by bumping the rate from 11% to 14%. But just last year, the city generated $128 million of new revenue by bumping that tax rate from 9 to 11%. So going from 9 to 14% in just a matter of 2 years is a pretty significant increase.
Taxing tech companies was a theme in this proposal because Johnson also proposed a tax on social media companies. Can you talk about how that will work? Because it's, in comparison to the cloud computing tax, like a smaller pot of money, but it's similarly unusual for people. They might not know exactly how it works.
Well, nobody knows quite how it's going to be working because it's the first in the nation, and it would potentially sort of set a template for other cities and towns to tax social media companies like X, formerly known as Twitter, and Facebook, and Blue Sky, and all of the different ones that we all spend too much time on. And the mayor's argument is that the city taxes amusements. Right? So you go to a show, you are going to pay a little bit of money on that ticket to the city. And that's going to go for, police services and all sorts of different things because, people go to a show, maybe they get rowdy, maybe the police have to come out. That's sort of the theory. That's the theory of those taxes. Johnson is putting forward a theory of this tax that social media is harming all of our mental health and that it is sort of it's draining the city's resources because more people are struggling. So this tax would levy a tax of 50 cents per month per user on social media platforms who have more than 100,000 users. So it is no doubt going to be challenged in court if it makes it into the final budget. But Johnson has said that that will generate about $30 million, so not a huge amount of money. But he says he'll put that in a special fund, and he will use that to basically bolster the city's mental health crisis network. So that's public clinics where people can go and they don't have to pay. And it will also sort of permanently give a funding source for the city's alternate response program. So if somebody who's experiencing a mental health crisis in some parts of the city at certain times of day, the police won't come. Instead, it will be counselors, it will be social workers, it will be substance abuse experts to sort of help that person deal with whatever they're dealing with rather than sort of sending an armed police officer who might arrest that person.
Do you think, like rhetorically speaking, these are signs of, like you said, Mayor Johnson no longer being a rookie mayor? Because it seems that by attaching these to investments in public safety, it makes it harder for alders to push back on them because then he goes, well, you don't want to keep our community safe. And I wonder, when Bring Chicago Home, you're attaching funding for the unhoused to this sort of real estate transfer tax. It didn't work as easily to sort of convince people, but it seems like he's trying to kind of double down on that strategy of attaching a potential new tax revenue source directly to the type of investments he promised, but also the type of investments a lot of Chicagoans want to see.
Right. There's no doubt that he and his administration learned the lesson of Bring Chicago Home. It speaks more to sort of the demands of the groups that elected him in 2023, many of who felt very angry and very betrayed by that $300 million property tax increase that he proposed a year ago. And I think it makes the case that the old way government has been funded is no longer working. And the city's ability to sort of change the way that its own government is funded is very limited. So I think that had the mayor had the ability, he would have done other stuff, right? He would have raised that transfer tax for real estate sales over $1 million himself, or he would have asked the city council to do it. City council can't do it. They need a change in state law or a referendum of the voters.
I was just going to say, a reminder to people, Bring Chicago Home ultimately failed at the ballot and
right.
Like you said, would have raised real estate transfer tax on those property sales over $1 million, which that was an early and really sort of heartbreaking loss for the mayor's office.
Yeah, it was there's no doubt it was a real setback, which is why every once in a while you hear him talking about trying it again. So the other thing is that the other biggest source of revenue for state government is the sales tax, right? You pay a little bit every time you go and you buy a new pair of headphones or you buy a new shirt. But what doesn't get sales taxed is services. So when I go to get my hair cut, or if I go to get my nails done, I'm not paying sales tax. And a lot of our economy has shifted from sort of focused on goods than services and experiences. Now, that would also require a change in state law. And the folks in Springfield have seemed really uninterested in sort of expanding the city's ability to sort of tax its residents in a different way. And there are a bunch of reasons for that. Nobody likes to vote for a tax increase. Nobody likes to sort of, make an argument that people need to pay more money to the government when this sort of sentiment that government isn't working is very widespread. So it's a heavy lift. So I think that you can read this budget from the mayor as sort of 2 years into office, him sort of saying, I was elected to do different stuff. Let's do different stuff. And I think that it will be very interesting to see sort of how that fares through the city council.
We know that homelessness is a problem in Chicago and across the country, but for unhoused women and femmes, those dangers only multiply. There are proven solutions to ending chronic homelessness, permanent housing paired with supportive services. Deborah's Place is celebrating 40 years as Chicago's largest provider of permanent supportive housing for women. On Saturday, November 1st, Deborah's Place will kick off Homelessness Awareness Month with a 1.5-mile community walk. You can walk from East Garfield Park to West Humble Park alongside staff, supporters, and residents of Deborah's Place. Join to raise awareness for compassionate, effective solutions to homelessness. Learn more, register, or donate at deborahsplace.org. Starting to feel that draft come through your windows? Well, it's only October, so, I can imagine it's probably going to get a little bit worse as it gets breezier and colder. So get ahead before your heating bill starts to feel the blow and install top quality, affordable windows from Window Nation. Or reach out to your landlord and put them on it. You see, with a lifetime warranty and one-day installation, you can relax knowing Window Nation has you covered. Make no payments for 2 years. That's no monthly payment, no down payments, and no interest until 2027. That's a pretty solid deal, you ask me, with all this holiday spending that's coming up. Get started on your free estimate before Halloween to save big. Schedule a fast free estimate now with the pros at Window Nation. Call 866-90-NATION or visit windownation.com. We are not out of the taxes weeds with our friend Heather Sharon from WTTW just yet. Another one that's got people buzzing is the corporate head tax, basically a tax that businesses with over 100 employees in Chicago will pay per employee. Former Mayor Rahm Emanuel eliminated a previous version of this over 10 years ago, back in 2014. It's pretty much universally despised by business leaders. Folks have already come out and said Johnson is trying to kill any attempt at businesses resurging in the city. Is there a chance that this passes this city council?
Sure. The city has $1 billion deficit. Like, the money's got to come from somewhere. And I think that what we're going to hear the mayor say to those on the city council who don't like this tax is say, okay, what else you got? You don't want this tax.
Go find that money for me somewhere else.
Exactly. The problem is that if you are not doing something like this, really, there are very few other options than property tax. And nobody wants to say, I'm going to push through a property tax. And, so I think what the mayor is hoping is that he's sort of, in a moment where he's telling his critics who say, well, you're hurting business, well, you're hurting X, you're hurting Y. He's saying, put up or shut up. And he's making a very clear argument about this tax in specific. So if you talk to the people who lead sort of Chicago's organizations, they will tell you that for Chicago businesses to flourish, Chicago has to be safe. Downtown has to be inviting. Their employees have to be able to get to and from work on the CTA without sort of being accosted. And the mayor is saying that he would use this $100 million that he thinks the tax will generate to basically bolster bolster efforts to reduce violence. Now, not with the police, but with violence interruption programs and with efforts to fund youth employment programs, because, if you've got teens who've got a job, they're probably not out, doing vandalism and vaping, as I like to joke. This fund also has the benefit, the mayor thinks, as sort of being a one-to-one replacement for funds that have been cut by the Trump administration. The Trump administration has slashed funding for violence intervention programs, for gender-based violence programs. And at the same time, he's reminding wealthy Chicagoans and the businesses that they just got massive federal tax breaks. And he says, look, so you're saving on that side. Let's reinvest some of that money in the city. Now, did Chicago's business community say, why, yes, Mayor Johnson, you are absolutely right. That is a great argument? No, they did not. They sent emails immediately saying this would kill jobs. This would force businesses to relocate out of Chicago. This will make our sort of city's business post-pandemic recovery even harder. But there are other people who say that, it's been a while since Chicago businesses and big Chicago businesses, 97% of Chicago businesses won't pay this tax. The mayor's office says that they simply can afford to pay more, and that it's time for the city to ask them to do so.
If you ask downtown Alder Brian Hopkins in the second ward, he already believes Johnson does not have the 26 votes necessary to get this passed. And one thing we have seen, whether it was Bring Chicago Home, whether it was the fight to raise the sub-minimum wage, whether it was the gradual income tax some years ago, business communities, business leaders, business organizations, one thing they do well is effective messaging in terms of and it seems like because they really have one consistent message. This thing will hurt us. We'll kill jobs. We're being penalized for employing people. And we've seen that messaging sometimes works and sometimes gets through. On the revenue side, other tax increases include sports betting, a hemp tax, expanding the congestion surcharge for rideshare users, and increasing some of those boat fees for people who dock along the lake. But let's talk spending cuts. What is on the chopping block in this proposal?
So there are not a lot of spending cuts, and that is also going to be a source of contention among more conservative members of the city council who believe that Chicago's government is just too big.
That we don't have a budget problem. We have a size and spending problem.
Right. Now, what's interesting about this is that, so it's a $16.6 billion budget. That's a lot of money, but there's only sort of a fraction that the city council has control over, because most of the budget has to go to pensions, has to pay for the airports, has to do X, has to do Y. Now, of the city's sort of discretionary money, and that's money that they can decide where to spend, essentially.
How much is that chunk of the nearly $17 billion?
So it depends on how you sort of break it down, but like more than half of that discretionary amount goes to the Chicago Police Department. And if you ask these alder people, great, okay, let's cut spending. What programs do you want to cut? If they're going to cut the health department, if they're going to cut the environment department, if they're going to cut streets and sand, you're talking about like only a couple of $1 million here or there. To get anywhere near sort of like substantive cuts, you would be looking at the police department, and they all completely rule out any cut to the police department whatsoever.
What is this lack of political will, or this, complete opposition to attacking one of the biggest pots of the city budget, which is a police budget that has, gotten a percentage point bigger year over year?
Yeah. So I think that people, and I don't think this is wrong, that the central task of local government is to keep people safe. And if you take money away from the police department, politicians, elected officials open themselves up to sort of criticism that they're not doing enough to keep their constituents safe. And it is really hard to get reelected if you are somebody who is seen as somebody as putting your residents at risk. The problem is that if you want to shrink city government, you're going to have to shrink the police department, but nobody wants to shrink the police department that also wants to shrink the size of city government. So it is between a rock and a hard place. Now, the mayor is saying that he wants to cut $50 million from the police department's more than $2 billion budget by eliminating positions that are unlikely to be filled in the next year. He says he will also do a better job of containing overtime spending, which has, skyrocketed beyond.
You see my face. So it's like, yes. No matter what number they write down for police overtime or paying out police violence settlements, that number is likely to be a fraction of what the ultimate number is. Right. Let me ask you right now, what for this year, what was the overtime budget? And do you have a sense of where they are on that right now?
So the overtime budget this year was $100 million, as it's been every year since I started covering the city government.
So for a decade.
For a decade. And they exceeded that budget less than 6 months into the year. And it is, not something that anybody wants to say, stop spending overtime, because there are public safety threats, right? Like we can't have people calling 911 like, hi, I'm being chased by a serial killer. Please send somebody to help. Sorry, we have exceeded our overtime budget and there's nobody on call. Like, that's not how this all works. But on the other hand, if there aren't any controls on what this department spends, then it raises real questions about who's in charge and do budgets actually mean anything? And
going through your overtime budget before you even hit the summer, we can only imagine what that final total will be by the end of the year.
Yeah. So last year it was almost $300 million just in Chicago Police Department overtime. And so Johnson says that this budget is going to require the police department to basically come back to the city council if it is overspending its overtime budget, to ask for more money as sort of a check and balance type situation. But, if you have a city council that is basically written the police department a blank check, while at the same time other departments stop spending as much, that it's a real question of sort of how does that math.
I appreciate you going through that. 3 times your budget. And again, that's just one part of the overall police budget. Again, they also blew through
the settlements.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah. And, I think that so every year, again, pretty much since I've started covering, it's been $82 million a year for misconduct settlements. And this year, we are already at more than $230 million in terms of settlements. And the city essentially has already written an IOU for next year amounting for $90 million. Now, that's the money that's going to go to the victims who say that are people who say they were victims of now convicted former Sergeant Ronald Watts. They say he framed them, they spent time in prison, and they're going to get a collective $90 million. Now, the city reached a deal with their lawyers to say, we're not going to pay you that money until next year because we can't afford it this year. But that means that next year...
The budget is already gone. The 82 million already spent.
Right.
Already spent. Plus 8.
Right.
Plus 8.
Right. So the city's going to have to do something very different in terms of how it budgets for settlements and that sort of thing. And the city has acknowledged that the only way they're going to pay for what they've already spent this year in terms of settlements is to borrow money for next year. Now, we don't know how much money they're going to have to borrow to do that. They're also going to have to borrow to pay what they owe to Chicago's roughly 5,000 firefighters and paramedics who had been working without a contract for 4 years. So they're now due retroactive pay raises for those years that they worked without raises. That is in the neighborhood of $185 million. So I think when all is said and done, the city is going to have to borrow somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 to $400 million just to cover these costs. The city does not have an extra $300 or $400 million, which is why, there's going to be a lot of controversy about this $100 million head tax, right? Well, that is sort of only a fraction of what the city actually needs. And it means that the city's budget is going to remain, as I like to say, deeply out of whack, with expenses really outstripping its ability to pay for it.
One thing people may be confused about is they see $1 billion budget gap, but then say that the plan from the mayor's office is hopefully to use a record-breaking $1 billion surplus from TIF funds, which is nearly double how much they declared last year. Where's that money going if it isn't directly filling this budget gap? How does that work?
So it's really complicated, and I'm glad that you've had me on the show. We can be here for the next hour, settle in, get a snack, get something to drink. But I will do my best to explain this. So tax increment financing is basically a way for the government to say, look, we believe this area is blighted. So as property taxes in this area rise, because we're going to try to redevelop some stuff, we're going to take that money and we're going to reinvest it in that area. So all of that money goes into a fund until the government is ready to sort of spend it on new roads or new sidewalks or whatever it is that they want to do. So that money sits in accounts, and the city has a lot of money, almost $3 billion in those accounts that are just sort of waiting for the city to do something with it. So what the mayor has said he will do is that he will say, look, in those funds, we have $1 billion that we are not going to need for redevelopment efforts. So we're going to send that money back to the taxing districts that we essentially—
How can you say that? We have so much need for redevelopment, especially in communities that have been disinvesting. How can that argument be made?
So a lot of this money is not coming from the areas that need redevelopment. This is money that came from downtown and the north side and that sort of thing. So there's a limit to how much you can do downtown with TIF money, right? Because it's, already doing pretty okay. Now, if you look at a place like Englewood or Auburn Gresham, you're like, yes, I've got lots of stuff we could do. Like, let's go. They can't use money collected from downtown property owners to improve Auburn Gresham. So in some ways, the money isn't being generated where it is most needed. This is sort of the fundamental problem with TIF and sort of how this all is set up.
And it's the reason people want to get rid of some of these TIF districts.
So if the mayor declares $1 billion to be in surplus, like I said, it'll go back to the taxing agencies. More than 50%, so like $500 million will go to CPS, the schools. And they're going to use that money to pay the pension bill that they haven't paid in the last couple of years and to avoid having to make any cuts during the middle of this school year. The city will get somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 million, and the rest will go to the smaller taxing agencies like the library and the park district and the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District and that sort of thing. But if you reduce those funds, that means eventually you're going to not be able to do those redevelopment projects. So there are going to be a lot of questions about, well, does this mean that projects are going to be canceled and that stuff that's been long in the works isn't going to happen? So we're going to have a lot of questions about that. Also, I just want to say that every year it is the Cook County Clerk's sort of responsibility to put out annual reports about how much money is in these TIF districts. And I just pulled it up on my computer and we still don't have the report for 2024. So the mayor says there's $1 billion in surplus. I certainly, don't have any reason to believe that there isn't $1 billion in surplus, but there's no way to see where that money is or where it would come from or what might be canceled. And I think that's a problem. And I think it's a problem that the mayor's office is saying, well, we don't know how much we're going to need to borrow to keep next year's budget out of the red.
No, I feel you 100% because beyond setting the priority, giving the mayor and his administration opportunity to say where they would like to see money go, a lot of this year over year are, like you said, they're TIF surplus that we can't approve ahead of time and borrowing that we're not really sure of and budgets for settlements that, we end up paying 3 times the same amount, or we were expecting to raise this much money on this type of tax and that didn't happen. Are these budget proposals Like, do they really mean anything? Or is it just words on a page and monopoly money at the end of the day? Because, if I don't pay my bills, debt go into collection. If the city don't pay its bills, it raise money, find money, shift money, move money, pay CPS so CPS can pay back the city. It feels like a lot of accounting tricks and shifting money around, which I understand. We're talking about the third largest city in the country. It is very complicated. But does that in some way kind of harm the efficacy residents can take out of these proposal and budget processes?
Absolutely. So I mentioned before that one of the sort of the biggest problem Johnson faces, the city council faces, is the sense that government is not working for the people. And when you have that sense that it's all monopoly money and it's all made up and it doesn't matter, I think that makes it really hard for people to feel good about paying their taxes or, sort of believing that what they are getting for their dollars makes sense.
I mean, all of this still has to go through the city council. Last year's council really shot down the signature element of Johnson's proposal, that massive property tax hike. You've seen throughout his administration pushback, even from people he would consider his allies. How do you think politics will play out this year, especially with a national election on the forecast? And then, we ain't too far from Johnson having to try to run this thing back and win favor across the city again.
Yeah, so it's going to be tough, but I will tell you a funny story about last year's budget speech. So the way it works is that the mayor gives the speech, everybody claps, and then all of the alder people and the reporter run out of the chambers and we, stick our phones in their faces and say, what do you think about the mayor's proposal? And one of the first alder people who was out there talking to the reporters was Alderman Byron Sigcho Lopez, who is perhaps the mayor's most loyal supporter on the city council. And he said, nope, I'm not going to vote for a property tax hike. It's dead.
This was last year.
This was last year. And that sort of immediate rejection of sort of this, like you said, the central part of the budget made all of us sort of open our eyes a little bit wider. Because not only did that surprise his fellow progressive members of the city council, it surprised the mayor, and it made it clear that he had sort of deeply miscalculated what the city council would affect. Now, by contrast, this year, immediately after the mayor stopped talking, the Progressive Caucus huddled together on the floor of the city council and sort of talked about what they had just heard. And then they all went together to the cameras to sort of present a united front of saying, we think there's a lot of interesting stuff in this proposal that makes us heartened to sort of begin to start this work. Now, none of them said, this is great, I'm going to vote for it, budget's over, let's start cooking for Thanksgiving. But it was a much different sort of reaction to it, because the mayor's budget was much more different and was much more grounded in sort of what I think his allies expected him to propose. This sort of sense of, we're going to make the ultra rich, as he likes to call them, and big business and big tech shoulder more of this burden. So now the onus is really going to shift to people who don't want to do that. Like I said, it's put up or shut up time. You don't want businesses to pay more because you think that would hurt them. Great. Chicago's got to pay its bills. And if you think Chicago needs money from another source, let's go.
It sounds like when Alder of the 20th Ward, Jeanette Taylor, said, hey, maybe we weren't ready for the fifth floor. And it's starting to sound like, now they ready now, and they playing the Chicago game as best they can, given all of the pressures that the mayor's office is facing right now.
Well, that's certainly what the mayor wants you to think. I also think as, perhaps counterintuitively, it has been Trump, the president saying things like Brandon Johnson should be in jail and sending the National Guard and sort of denigrating him over and over again as a low IQ person, I think is a political gift to Johnson like nothing else. Because if you are against Johnson, and there are certainly a number of sort of ideological and rational ways to sort of oppose what the mayor, believes in sort of his approach to politics, you open yourself up to aligning with Trump. And that is a difficult sort of political negotiation that we have seen people for trying to pull off. We've got Alderman Brendan Riley of the 42nd Ward downtown. He's running against Cook County Board President Toni Preckwinkle in the March primary for Cook County Board President. And if you watch his launch video, he spends the first couple of minutes talking about how he doesn't agree with Trump, but he doesn't think Toni Preckwinkle is the right person to lead the county. That is a difficult two-step that makes it very different for really everybody to go.
As you make your way through this proposal, and again, there are other drafts we should expect before we get to its final form, does this budget do things to kind of help Trump-proof the city? People who are losing health care as capital projects like the Red Line extension are being threatened. Does this make any waves in terms of protecting Chicagoans from those federal funding cuts? Or is this a budget that is as much in the wait and see process as the rest of us?
So there's only so much the city can do, right? The federal government cut $1 trillion from Medicare and Medicaid. The city cannot make up that for Chicago residents. 1 in 5 Chicago families does not have enough to eat on a regular basis. The city does not have the ability to, reinstitute, SNAP for those families that's been cut by the federal government. The city cannot find $2 billion to keep building the Red Line extension if Trump succeeds in sort of eliminating that federal funding. So can the city do things on the margins to make people a little bit safer? Sure, there's some money for, defense of undocumented immigrants. Like I said, some of the money will go, if the head tax is adopted, to protect violence interruption programs. But those are the margins, right? The city does not have the ability to replace, somewhere in the neighborhood between $3 and $4 billion that it gets every year from the federal government. And most of that money is non-discretionary, right? The federal government gives you money for, food assistance. You don't get to decide to spend that on, sidewalk repair. So right now, the city has sort of beat back those legal efforts to yank that funding from the federal government. But we've also seen the president try different ways to take funding from places where he feels like his opponents are in power. And if anybody tells you that they know exactly how that's going to play out 3 months from now, 6 months from now, they're lying to you.
There were a lot of details here. We appreciate you moving through them with us. If you want to see some of Heather's reporting, please visit our show notes. But in the meantime, in between time, joining me in thanking our guest today from WTTW City Hall reporter Heather Cherone. Always a great time.
Always fun. And thank you for letting me go all the way into the weeds on this stuff with you.
Of course, we can't close the door without some good news. The Bulls are back for their season opener at the UC Wednesday night against the Pistons. And I know what you're thinking, Kobe, how the hell is this good news after yet another disappointing bottom-feeding season? I just want to remind you, despite our disappointment, right, and almost 30 years since we didn't sniff championship glory, the UC remains the most well-attended NBA arena and one of the most engaged fan bases in the league. It is still a worthwhile experience in the city, y'all. And even if you need to just check the schedule to know when to avoid driving by, I'm going to put it in our show notes for you. As always, I appreciate you for listening and reading. We're going to be back bright and early tomorrow. We'll talk to you then. Peace. I mean, you're the expert here. So if I incorrectly ask a question, if I use the wrong figure, feel free to correct me. I'll take it again so that the people don't know I was wrong. Just you.